September 12, 1943. 22,000 feet above Wewak, New Guinea. First Lieutenant Richard Ira Bong felt the control stick vibrate beneath his gloved hand as his P-38 Lightning sliced through the humid tropical air at 320 miles per hour. Through the curved plexiglass canopy, he could see the coastline of New Guinea stretching below like a rumpled green carpet thrown carelessly across the Bismarck Sea. His wingman, Second Lieutenant Thomas Lynch, held position 500 feet to his right, the twin booms of Lynch's Lightning glinting in the harsh Pacific sunlight. The radio crackled in Bong's headset. Bandits, 2 o'clock high. Count 30 plus. The voice belonged to Major Gerald Johnson, leading their flight of 8 P-38 seconds from the 49th Fighter Group. Bong's eyes snapped to the indicated position. There they were, a swarm of Japanese fighters, their distinctive silhouettes unmistakable even at this distance. Mitsubishi A6M Zeros, the aircraft that had terrorized Allied pilots for the first 2 years of the Pacific War. Bong's hand moved instinctively to his throttles, advancing them slightly as he began a climbing turn to gain altitude advantage. Standard doctrine, textbook tactics. Everything he had been taught at flight school and refined through dozens of combat missions. But what happened in the next 17 minutes would shatter every rule in the fighter pilot's handbook. In those 17 minutes, Bong would execute a maneuver so dangerous that flight instructors explicitly forbade it. A split S at low altitude with enemy fighters above and behind him. The maneuver that every manual warned would result in certain death. Instead, it would trigger a chain reaction of events that would see 15 Japanese Zeros falling from the sky, establishing a single mission record that would stand as one of the most remarkable achievements in aerial combat history. The mathematics of what Bong accomplished that day defy probability. Against superior numbers, using a maneuver that should have killed him, he would demonstrate that sometimes the most dangerous decision is the correct one. The journey to that moment had begun 23 years earlier, in a farmhouse outside Poplar, Wisconsin. Richard Ira Bong was born on September 24, 1920, the eldest of 9 children in a Swedish immigrant family that farmed 240 acres of land in Superior, Wisconsin. His father, Carl Bong, had emigrated from Sweden as a young man, bringing with him the work ethic and practical problem-solving approach that characterized Scandinavian farming communities. The Bong farm was not wealthy, but it was self-sufficient. The family grew their own food, raised livestock, and maintained their equipment through ingenuity and hard work. Young Richard learned early that when something broke, you fixed it yourself. When a problem arose, you thought through solutions methodically. When a task needed doing, you did it without complaint. These lessons, absorbed in the frozen Wisconsin winters and humid summers, would serve him extraordinarily well in the cockpit of a fighter aircraft. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The young Bong showed mechanical aptitude from an early age. He could disassemble and repair farm equipment with a facility that impressed his father. He understood how engines worked, how mechanical systems interacted, how to diagnose problems through sound and feel. By age 12, he was maintaining the family's tractors and trucks with minimal supervision. This intimate understanding of machinery would prove invaluable when he transitioned to aircraft, where mechanical sympathy, the ability to understand what your machine was telling you through vibration, sound, and response, could mean the difference between life and death. But it wasn't just machinery that interested him. Bong was fascinated by flight. The sight of aircraft passing overhead, rare in rural Wisconsin during the 1930s, transfixed him. He built model airplanes from wood and paper, studying their aerodynamics, experimenting with different wing shapes and control surface configurations. He read everything he could find about aviation, devouring accounts of World War I aces and contemporary racing pilots. By the time he graduated from Poplar High School in 1938, he knew with absolute certainty that he wanted to fly. The problem was money. Flight training was expensive, far beyond the means of a farming family during the Depression. But Bong had inherited his father's determination. He enrolled at Superior State Teachers College, now the University of Wisconsin-Superior, studying to become a teacher while working part-time jobs to save money for flying lessons. In May 1939, at age 18, he earned enough to begin flight instruction at a local airfield. His instructor, a barnstormer named Howard Smith, immediately recognized Bong's natural talent. The young man had exceptional hand-eye coordination and spatial awareness. He could feel what the aircraft was doing through the controls, sensing stalls before instruments indicated them, correcting for wind drift instinctively. Most importantly, he remained calm under pressure. When unexpected situations arose during training, situations that caused other students to freeze or panic, Bong methodically worked through the problem. After just 8 hours of dual instruction, Smith soloed him. That was fast, even for a naturally gifted student. Most pilots of that era required 15 to 20 hours before their instructor felt confident letting them fly alone. Bong's rapid progress suggested something beyond mere talent. He possessed an intuitive understanding of flight dynamics that couldn't be taught, only refined through practice. When the United States Army Air Corps announced an expansion program in 1941, creating thousands of new pilot slots, Bong immediately applied. His timing was perfect. The military needed pilots desperately, as war clouds gathered over both Europe and the Pacific. The peacetime force of a few thousand pilots would need to expand to tens of thousands, eventually hundreds of thousands. Bong was accepted into the Aviation Cadet Program in May 1941 and reported to the Santa Ana Army Air Base in California for pre-flight training. The curriculum was rigorous, designed to weed out candidates who lacked the physical stamina, mental acuity, or psychological stability required for combat flying. Classes in navigation, meteorology, aircraft identification, theory of flight, and military discipline filled 14-hour days. Physical training pushed cadets to their limits. The attrition rate exceeded 30%. Bong thrived. The farm boy from Wisconsin who had grown up doing hard physical labor found the exercise regimen challenging but manageable. The academic coursework, which overwhelmed some cadets with no technical background, came naturally to someone who understood mechanical systems. He graduated near the top of his class and advanced to primary flight training at Gardner Field, California. Primary training introduced cadets to military flying in the Stearman PT-13 biplane, a rugged trainer that was forgiving of student mistakes but demanded proper technique. Bong excelled, demonstrating the smooth, coordinated flying that characterizes truly skilled pilots. His instructor noted in his evaluation that Bong had, quote, exceptional feel for the aircraft and outstanding situational awareness. After primary came basic training at Bakersfield, California, flying the Vultee BT-13 Valiant, a more powerful aircraft that introduced cadets to higher speeds, retractable landing gear, and more complex systems. Again, Bong distinguished himself, mastering formation flying, instrument flight, and night operations with minimal difficulty. His instructor recommended him for advanced single-engine training, the track that led to fighter assignment rather than bombers or transports. Advanced training at Luke Field, Arizona, put cadets into the North American AT-6 Texan, an aircraft that approximated the performance and handling characteristics of frontline fighters. The AT-6 was fast, responsive, and unforgiving of sloppy flying. It could bite inexperienced pilots who became complacent. Bong handled it beautifully, demonstrating the aggressive flying style that fighter pilots needed. He pushed the aircraft to its limits in aerobatic maneuvers, learning how it behaved at the edges of its performance envelope. On January 9, 1942, just 33 days after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Bong graduated from advanced flying school and received his silver pilot's wings and commission as a second lieutenant in the United States Army Air Forces. His timing was both fortunate and unfortunate. Fortunate because the military needed fighter pilots desperately as war expanded across both the Atlantic and Pacific. Unfortunate because the learning curve in combat was steep and paid in blood. Bong was assigned to fighter transition training at Hamilton Field, California, where he would learn to fly the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, one of the most distinctive and capable fighter aircraft of World War II. The P-38 was revolutionary, a twin-engine, twin-boom design that looked like nothing else in the sky. Two Allison V1000, 710 12-cylinder liquid-cooled engines, each producing 1,150 horsepower, powered the aircraft through counter-rotating propellers that eliminated torque effects. The engines were mounted in booms extending back from the wings. The pilot sat in a central nacelle between the booms, providing excellent visibility in all directions. The aircraft's armament was concentrated in the nose of that central nacelle. 4 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns and one 20mm Hispano cannon, all firing directly forward with no need for convergence angles or synchronization with propellers. This nose-mounted battery could put a devastating weight of fire into a single point, making the P-38 an extraordinarily deadly gun platform if the pilot could get into position to use it. The Lightning was fast, capable of speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour at altitude. It climbed well, reaching 30,000 feet in under 12 minutes. Its rate of roll was respectable for such a large aircraft. The twin engines provided redundancy. If one engine failed, a skilled pilot could return to base on the remaining engine, a capability that saved many lives over the vast distances of the Pacific Theater, where a single-engine fighter losing its power plant meant ditching in the ocean. But the P-38 had quirks that demanded respect. The aircraft was heavy, weighing over 17,000 pounds fully loaded, making it less maneuverable in sustained turning combat than lighter single-engine fighters like the Zero. The cockpit was complex, with dozens of switches, levers, and instruments spread across multiple panels. Engine management required constant attention. Each engine had its own throttle, propeller control, and mixture lever. Pilots had to coordinate power settings between engines to maintain balanced flight. The most dangerous characteristic was compressibility. When diving at high speed, the P-38 could encounter aerodynamic effects, where the airflow over the wings approached the speed of sound, creating shock waves that disrupted control effectiveness. The nose would tuck downward, and the elevator controls would become mushy or reversed. Pilots who encountered compressibility in a dive sometimes found themselves unable to pull out, with fatal results. The solution, dive recovery flaps that increased tail effectiveness, wouldn't be installed until later production models. Bong mastered the Lightning's complexities with the same methodical approach he had applied to farm machinery. He studied the aircraft's systems until he understood every component. He practiced emergency procedures until his responses became automatic. He flew every day that weather permitted, building time and experience. By the time he completed transition training in May 1942, he had logged over 300 hours in the P-38 and was rated as an exceptional pilot. But there was a problem. Bong's aggressive flying style, which would serve him so well in combat, got him into trouble during peacetime training. On one memorable occasion, he flew his P-38 at low altitude down Market Street in San Francisco, looping around the center span of the Golden Gate Bridge before returning to base. The stunt, while demonstrating extraordinary skill and confidence, violated multiple regulations and resulted in a formal reprimand. General George Kenny, who would later become Bong's commanding officer in the Pacific, supposedly told him during the reprimand, "If you want to be a hot pilot, go to New Guinea. They need hot pilots out there." Whether that exact conversation occurred or is apocryphal, the sentiment was accurate. The Pacific Theater needed aggressive, skilled fighter pilots desperately. In September 1942, Bong deployed to the Southwest Pacific Theater, assigned to the 9th Fighter Squadron of the 49th Fighter Group, based at Darwin, Australia. The tactical situation in the Pacific at that time was precarious. Japan controlled a vast empire stretching from Burma to the mid-Pacific Islands. Allied forces were barely holding defensive positions in Australia and were beginning the long, bloody campaign to push Japanese forces back. The air war in the Southwest Pacific differed fundamentally from the European theatre. Distances were enormous. Flights routinely covered hundreds of miles over open ocean or trackless jungle, where a forced landing meant almost certain death. Weather was treacherous, with violent thunderstorms that could tear aircraft apart. Navigation was challenging, with few reliable landmarks. Radio communications were often poor or non-existent. The Japanese Air Force's Bong would face were formidable. The Zero fighter, officially the Mitsubishi A6M, had earned a fearsome reputation in the first year of the Pacific War. It could outmaneuver, outclimb, and outrange any Allied fighter then in service. Its armament of two 20mm cannons and two 7.7mm machine guns was deadly. Its range of over 1,600 miles allowed it to operate far from bases, surprising Allied forces who thought they were beyond enemy reach. But the Zero had vulnerabilities. It achieved its exceptional performance through lightweight construction that sacrificed protection. The aircraft lacked armor plating for the pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks. A few hits from .50 caliber machine guns could destroy it. The lightweight airframe couldn't withstand the stresses of high-speed maneuvers. If a pilot tried to dive away from combat at speeds exceeding 350 miles per hour, the wings might fold. Allied pilots developed tactics that exploited these weaknesses. Boom and zoom attacks, diving from altitude at high speed, firing a burst, then climbing away before the Zero could respond. Never engage in turning combat where the Zero's superior maneuverability gave it advantage. Use the P-38's superior speed and diving capability to dictate engagement terms. Fight vertically, not horizontally. Bong absorbed these tactical lessons during his first combat missions in late 1942. His first confirmed victory came on December 27th, when he shot down a Zero over Buna, New Guinea. The engagement followed the prescribed tactics. Bong dove from altitude, lined up the Zero in his sights as it maneuvered below him, fired a 2-second burst that shredded the Japanese fighter's wing, and climbed away before other enemy aircraft could respond. The Zero spun into the jungle, its pilot killed instantly. That first kill established Bong's reputation as a deadly shot. His gunnery was exceptional. Where other pilots might need multiple passes and hundreds of rounds to destroy a target, Bong typically needed one pass and a short burst. He understood deflection shooting instinctively, calculating the lead angle required to put bullets where the target would be rather than where it was. His farm-bred mechanical sympathy translated into an understanding of his gun sight and how to use it effectively. Over the following months, Bong's score climbed steadily. 2 victories in January 1943, 3 in February, 4 in March. By mid-1943, he had established himself as one of the top aces in the Pacific theatre, with 16 confirmed victories. But what happened on September 12th would eclipse everything that had come before. The mission briefing on the morning of September 12th revealed a target-rich environment. Intelligence reported a major Japanese air build-up at Wewak, a coastal town on the north shore of New Guinea that served as a forward operating base for Japanese Army air units. Reconnaissance flights had identified over 200 Japanese aircraft dispersed across multiple airfields in the area. The planes included fighters, bombers, and reconnaissance aircraft. This concentration represented a significant threat to Allied operations. 5th Air Force Headquarters planned a coordinated strike involving heavy bombers, medium bombers, and fighter escorts. The bombers would attack the airfields themselves, cratering runways and destroying parked aircraft. The fighters would provide cover and engage any Japanese fighters that rose to defend. It was exactly the kind of large-scale air battle where aggressive fighter pilots could make their mark. The 49th Fighter Group launched 16 P-38 seconds to escort the bombers and conduct fighter sweeps over the target area. Bong led a flight of 8 Lightnings, with Major Gerald Johnson as overall flight leader. The plan called for the P-38 seconds to arrive over Wewak ahead of the bombers, clearing out defending fighters and establishing air superiority. The weather was typical for New Guinea. Scattered clouds at multiple altitudes, excellent visibility between clouds, occasional rain showers creating curtains of precipitation that reduced visibility to near zero. The temperature at 22,000 feet hovered around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, pleasant compared to the sweltering heat and humidity at ground level, where temperatures exceeded 90 degrees with crushing humidity. Bong's P-38, carrying the identification number 113, had been meticulously prepared by his ground crew. Both engines ran smoothly, producing full power without the rough running or oil leaks that plagued some lightnings. The armament had been test-fired and reharmonized, ensuring that all weapons converged at 300 feet, the optimal range for fighter combat. Ammunition loadouts were standard, 1,500 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition distributed among the 4 machine guns, and 150 rounds for the 20mm cannon. The flight from their forward base at Dobodura to Wewak covered approximately 200 miles, requiring 45 minutes at cruise power. The 8 P-38 seconds flew in a loose formation that allowed pilots to scan for enemy aircraft while maintaining mutual support. Radio discipline was strict. Unnecessary chatter cluttered communications and could mask critical warnings. As they approached Wewak from the south, climbing to altitude to gain tactical advantage, the scope of the Japanese presence became apparent. Below them, spread across multiple airfields, were dozens of aircraft. Most were parked, lined up in neat rows that would make perfect targets for the incoming bombers, but others were taxiing, and some were already airborne. Then Major Johnson's warning crackled over the radio. Bandits, 2 o'clock high. Count 30 plus. Bong looked in the indicated direction. There they were. A large formation of Japanese fighters, appearing to be entirely Zeros, climbing to intercept. The Japanese had detected the incoming raid and scrambled their fighters. What should have been a fighter sweep against parked aircraft had just become a major air battle. Standard tactics dictated that the P-38 seconds should maintain altitude advantage, forcing the Zeros to climb to engage. The Lightnings could then make diving attacks, using their speed to avoid prolonged combat where the Zeros' maneuverability became decisive. But the Japanese formation was already nearly at the same altitude as the P-38 seconds and climbing rapidly. The altitude advantage was marginal. Johnson made the decision to engage. All flights, attack at will, stay fast, and stay together. The 8 P-38 seconds split into 4 two-plane elements, each selecting targets from the swarm of ascending Zeros. Bong and Lynch stayed together as a team, diving toward a pair of Zeros that were climbing directly toward them. The geometry of head-on attacks favored neither side. Both aircraft were closing at combined speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour. Both pilots had only seconds to line up, fire, and break away before collision. It was a test of nerves as much as skill. The pilot who flinched first, who broke off early to avoid collision, gave his opponent the advantage. Bong didn't flinch. He lined up the lead Zero in his gun sight, seeing the aircraft grow rapidly from a distant speck to a fully visible fighter with the distinctive red circular insignia on its wings. At 400 yards, he pressed the firing button. The concentrated firepower of 4 50 calibers and 1 20mm cannon erupted from the P-38's nose. The recoil created a slight vibration, but not enough to disturb his aim. His rounds walked into the Zero's engine cowling. Pieces flew off. Smoke erupted. The Zero's propeller stopped, and the aircraft nosed over sharply. Bong broke right, pulling 4 Gs in a hard turn that grayed his vision momentarily. When he looked back, the Zero was spinning down trailing smoke. Its pilot had not bailed out. 1. Lynch had engaged the second Zero with similar results. The 2 P-38 seconds regrouped and climbed back to altitude, scanning for additional targets. They didn't have to look far. The sky was full of Zeros, swirling in combat with the other P-38 seconds. 2 Lightnings were already trailing smoke, heading for home with damage. But several Zeros had been destroyed, their burning wrecks spiraling down toward the green jungle below. Bong spotted another Zero making a firing pass on a P-38. The Lightning pilot was in trouble, trying to evade but losing altitude and speed. Within seconds, the Zero would be in position for a killing shot. Bong pushed his throttles forward to full power and dove toward the engagement. The closing speed was extreme. The Zero pilot, focused on his target, didn't see Bong approaching from his 6 o'clock high position. Bong lined up the shot, leading the Zero by what looked like 2 aircraft lengths to account for deflection and closure rate. He fired a 3-second burst. The first rounds missed, passing ahead of the Zero. But Bong walked his fire back, and the remainder of the burst caught the Zero's fuselage behind the cockpit. The 20mm cannon shells, each carrying a small explosive charge, detonated on impact. The Zero's fuselage disintegrated, the tail section separated, and the rest of the aircraft tumbled out of control. 2. The P-38 pilot, now free from attack, radioed his thanks and limped away toward home. Bong pulled up into a chandelle, a climbing turn that traded speed for altitude while changing direction. At the top of the maneuver, he rolled, wings level, and scanned the battlefield. What he saw was chaos. Zeros and P-38 seconds twisted through the sky in individual duels and multiplane furballs. Smoke trails marked falling aircraft, both American and Japanese. Parachutes dotted the sky where pilots had bailed from doomed aircraft. And then Bong made the decision that would define the engagement. Rather than withdrawing, as doctrine suggested when outnumbered, he dove back into the fight. His ammunition was still mostly full. His aircraft was undamaged. Lynch was still with him. And there were P-38 pilots down there who needed help. He selected a Zero that was pursuing another Lightning at medium altitude. The Zero pilot was good, staying behind the P-38 despite its attempts to evade. Within seconds, the Zero would be in position to fire. Bong dove from above, building speed rapidly. His airspeed indicator passed 350 miles per hour, then 375, then 400. The P-38 vibrated with the speed, but remained controllable. At 1,000 feet above the Zero, Bong fired a long burst. The combined firepower of 5 weapons created a stream of projectiles that converged on the Zero. The Japanese fighter exploded in mid-air, its fuel tanks ignited by the incendiary rounds mixed in with Bong's ammunition. He pulled out of the dive with 7 Gs on the airframe, the force crushing him down into his seat and draining blood from his brain. His vision tunneled to a narrow point directly ahead. He eased the back pressure on the stick, allowing his vision to clear, and climbed back to altitude again. The engagement had now been underway for approximately 8 minutes. 8 minutes of the most intense combat flying Bong had ever experienced. His shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cold air at altitude. His right hand, gripping the control stick, ached from the constant small corrections required to track targets. His ammunition counters showed he had expended about 40% of his 50 caliber ammunition and 60% of his 20mm rounds. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Bong was climbing back to altitude when he saw them. 5 Zeros in a tight formation, heading directly toward him from the north. They had altitude advantage, perhaps 2,000 feet above him. In a normal engagement, this would be a signal to disengage. 5 against 1, with the enemy holding altitude advantage, violated every principle of fighter combat. But these 5 Zeros were heading towards several P-38 seconds that were regrouping after their own combats, low on ammunition and likely damaged. The decision tree was simple. Bong could evade, diving away at high speed and leaving the other P-38 seconds to fend for themselves. Or he could engage, accepting terrible odds to buy time for his squadron mates. His farm-bred sense of duty didn't allow for the first option. He selected the lead Zero and began firing from maximum range over 600 yards. At this distance, hits were unlikely, but that wasn't the point. He wanted to distract the formation, force them to deal with him rather than pressing their attack on the other Lightnings. It worked. The 5 Zeros broke formation, 3 turning to engage Bong while 2 continued toward the P-38 seconds. Bong had improved the odds for his squadron mates, but his own situation was now desperate. 3 Zeros were diving on him from above with speed and position advantage. Standard doctrine said to dive away, using the P-38's superior speed to escape. But diving would take him toward the deck, reducing his options and bringing him within range of ground fire from Japanese positions. Climbing was impossible. The Zeros above him would catch him before he gained significant altitude. That left the horizontal. Bong broke hard left, pulling the P-38 into a maximum rate turn. 4 Gs then, 5, then 6 as he tightened the turn. The G-suit he wore inflated, squeezing his legs and abdomen to prevent blood from pooling and causing blackout. His vision narrowed but didn't tunnel completely. The P-38 shuddered on the edge of stalling, the buffet in the controls telling him he was asking for more performance than the wings could provide. The 3 Zeros followed him into the turn, and this was where the Zeros' superior maneuverability should have ended the fight. The A6M could outturn any American fighter of that era. In a sustained horizontal turning engagement, a Zero pilot would eventually work his way onto an opponent's tail and destroy him. But Bong didn't sustain the turn. After 90 degrees of turn, he reversed, rolling hard right and pulling in the opposite direction. The sudden reversal caught the Zero pilots off guard. They had committed to the left turn, and their momentum carried them through while Bong was already turning right. For a brief moment, perhaps 3 seconds, Bong had clear airspace. He used those seconds to position himself. Rolling wings level, he pulled the nose up into a zoom climb, trading speed for altitude. The P-38 climbed steeply, engines at maximum power. The vertical maneuver confused the Zero pilots. One tried to follow but didn't have the speed. The other 2 broke off, trying to reposition. At the top of the zoom climb, with airspeed nearly 0 and the P-38 on the edge of stalling, Bong executed a hammerhead turn. The maneuver, named because the aircraft traces a path resembling a hammerhead at the top, involved stopping the climb, applying full rudder to pivot the aircraft on its vertical axis, then diving back down in the opposite direction. It was a maneuver that required precise timing and feel for the aircraft. Execute it too early, with too much airspeed, and centrifugal forces could break the airframe. Execute it too late, after the aircraft stalled, and you entered an uncontrolled spin that might prove unrecoverable. Bong executed it perfectly. As he came back down from the hammerhead, now diving in the opposite direction from his original climb, he found himself above and behind one of the Zeros that had been chasing him. The geometry was perfect. The Zero was in a climb, trying to regain altitude, presenting a relatively stable target. Bong lined up the shot, led the Zero by the length of its fuselage, and fired. The burst caught the Zero in the wing root. The wing folded, torn away from the fuselage by the explosive force of the 20mm shells. The Zero tumbled sideways and fell. 4 confirmed. But there was no time to celebrate. The other 2 Zeros had repositioned and were diving on him from different angles, trying to sandwich him in a crossfire. Bong extended, pushing his throttles forward and diving to build speed. The P-38 accelerated rapidly, the twin Allisons producing maximum power. At 420 miles per hour, faster than the Zeros could match in level flight or shallow dives, Bong pulled up into another climb. This time, the Zeros couldn't follow. They were at the P-38's 6 o'clock, but falling behind as Bong climbed away. He had escaped the trap. Looking around, Bong realized the air battle had dispersed. The P-38 seconds and Zeros were scattered across 15 miles of sky, individual duels and small group actions rather than a single massive furball. Some aircraft were heading home, both American and Japanese. Others continued fighting. Burning wrecks dotted the landscape below, marking where aircraft had fallen. Bong's fuel gauges showed he had burned through half his internal fuel. The combat maneuvering, with engines at full power and multiple maximum performance climbs, consumed fuel at prodigious rates. He had perhaps 20 more minutes before he would need to head for home, regardless of the tactical situation. He spotted another lone P-38, pursued by 2 Zeros working as a team. The Japanese pilots were executing textbook tactics. 1 Zero would make a firing pass while the second positioned for a follow-up attack. The P-38 pilot was evading frantically but was being herded into a lower altitude where his options would diminish. Bong dove toward the engagement, calling on the radio to warn the P-38 pilot that help was coming. The reply crackled back immediately. "Roger, make it quick. I'm about Winchester." Out of ammunition. The P-38 pilot was defenseless. Bong approached from high 6 o'clock on the trailing Zero, the classic bounce position that every fighter pilot dreamed of achieving. The Zero pilot never saw him. Bong closed to 300 feet, the range where his harmonized guns converged for maximum effect, and fired a 2-second burst. All 5 weapons fired simultaneously, creating a cone of projectiles that converged on a point 300 feet ahead of the aircraft. The Zero disintegrated, pieces of airframe spinning away in all directions. The pilot's body, still, strapped to his seat, tumbled separately. 5 confirmed. The second Zero, seeing his wingman destroyed, broke off his attack on the P-38 and turned to face Bong. This pilot was clearly experienced. Instead of panicking or attempting to run, he accepted combat, turning to bring his own guns to bear. The 2 aircraft, P-38 and Zero, headed toward each other in another head-on pass. This time, the geometry was different. Both aircraft were at similar altitudes and speeds. Neither had a significant advantage. It would come down to who fired more accurately and who had the nerve to hold course longest. They closed rapidly. At 800 yards, the Zero pilot opened fire. Bong could see the tracer rounds arcing toward him, passing above and to the left. The Japanese pilot was leading too much, or his calibration was off. At 600 yards, Bong pressed his firing button. His tracers reached out toward the Zero. The first rounds passed ahead, but Bong adjusted, walking his fire back, into the target. At 400 yards, his rounds began hitting. The Zero's propeller disintegrated. Engine parts flew off. Still, the Japanese pilot held course, returning fire despite the damage. His rounds now came closer, some passing within feet of Bong's canopy. At 200 yards, both pilots broke, banking hard to avoid collision. Bong rolled right. The Zero rolled left. As they passed, Bong got a glimpse of the Zero pilot's face, visible through the canopy. Then they were past each other, and Bong pulled into a hard climbing turn to reposition. He looked back for the Zero. It was descending in a shallow glide, smoke pouring from the shattered engine. The propeller was gone completely. The Japanese pilot was trying for a forced landing, but with no power and heavy damage, his options were limited. The Zero struck the jungle canopy at over 150 miles per hour and disintegrated. 6 confirmed. Bong's radio crackled. Major Johnson's voice, strained but controlled. "All flights, reform and head home. Bombers are off target. Mission accomplished." The engagement had lasted 17 minutes from first contact to Johnson's recall order. Bong scanned his instruments. Fuel was now below 40%. Ammunition counters showed 30% remaining for the 50 calibers and less than 20% for the cannon. His aircraft had taken no hits, a minor miracle given the intensity of combat, but he was still over enemy territory with a long flight home ahead. He began a climbing turn to the south, heading back toward friendly territory. Lynch rejoined him, his P-38 showing battle damage, holes visible in the left boom and horizontal stabilizer. "You still flying, okay?" Bong asked over the radio. Lynch's reply was affirmative. The damage looked worse than it was. Flight controls responded normally. They climbed to 15,000 feet, a compromise altitude that balanced fuel economy against the need to maintain energy for combat, if more. Japanese fighters appeared. Below them, the jungle of New Guinea stretched endlessly, an unbroken carpet of green that would swallow any aircraft forced to land there. As they flew south, Bong reflected on what had just occurred. 6 confirmed victories in a single engagement. That brought his total score to 22, making him the second highest scoring American ace in any theatre, exceeded only by Captain Eddie Rickenbacker's 26 victories from World War I. But the day wasn't finished. 30 miles south of Wewak, Bong spotted aircraft ahead and below. His first thought was that these were more Zeros, perhaps returning to base after combat, but as he closed, he realized these aircraft were different. Not Zeros, but bombers. Japanese twin-engine bombers, likely Mitsubishi Ki 21 seconds, known to the Allies by the reporting name Sally. There were 9 bombers in a loose formation, flying at 10,000 feet. They appeared to be heading back toward Japanese bases after a mission. No fighter escort was visible. The bombers were alone and vulnerable. Standard doctrine was clear. Bong's primary mission had been completed. The fighter sweep over Wewak was finished. Engaging these Japanese bombers, while potentially profitable, risked aircraft and pilots that were needed for future missions. But 9 enemy bombers represented a significant threat. If they were allowed to escape, they would return to strike Allied forces another day. Bong made his decision. He called Lynch. "I'm going after the bombers. You can head home if your aircraft isn't up to it." Lynch's reply was immediate. "I'm with you. Let's get them." The 2 P-38 seconds dove on the bomber formation from above and behind. The Japanese bombers spotted them and tightened their formation, bringing their defensive guns to bear. Each Ki 21 Sally carried 5 7.7mm machine guns. 9 bombers meant 45 defensive weapons that could put up significant volume of fire. Bong selected the bomber on the left side of the formation. Attacking from high 6 o'clock, he dove through 4,000 feet of altitude, building speed to over 400 miles per hour. At 400 yards, he was well within effective range. He pressed the firing button and held it for a 3-second burst. His rounds converged on the Ki 21's left engine. Pieces flew off the engine cowling, smoke erupted, then flames. The bomber's left propeller windmilled briefly, then stopped as the pilot feathered it. With one engine out, the bomber began losing altitude and speed, falling behind the formation. 7 confirmed. Lynch made his attack run, targeting another bomber on the right side of the formation. His gunnery was equally effective. A 2-second burst shredded the bomber's right wing, tearing away control surfaces. The bomber rolled right, entering a spiral that steepened rapidly. It struck the jungle below seconds later. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The formation was now down to 7 bombers, but they continued flying. Bong repositioned for another attack, approaching from the right side at a 45-degree angle. He selected the lead bomber. At 600 yards, he opened fire. The lead bomber took hits across its entire fuselage. The cockpit canopy shattered. The pilot and co-pilot were killed instantly. The aircraft nosed over sharply and dove vertically into the jungle. 8 confirmed. But Bong's extended burst had consequences. His 50 caliber ammunition counters showed empty. The 4 machine guns had fired their last rounds. Only the 20mm cannon remained, and it had fewer than 20 rounds left. Lynch's ammunition was exhausted. He radioed Bong. "I'm Winchester, heading home." Bong was alone with 6 bombers still flying, and only 20 cannon rounds remaining. The smart decision was to break off and head home. He had already achieved an extraordinary score. 8 confirmed victories, but those 6 bombers were still a threat, and Bong had 20 rounds left. The mathematics suggested he could potentially get 2, maybe 3 more before running completely dry. He positioned for another attack, closing to 300 yards to ensure maximum effect from his limited remaining ammunition. He pressed the firing button. The 20mm cannon fired 6 rounds. 3 hit, striking the right engine and wing root. The engine exploded. The wing folded upward, The bomber rolled inverted and fell. 9 confirmed. 14 rounds remaining. 5 bombers still flying. Bong selected another bomber and closed to 250 yards, dangerously close but necessary to ensure his limited ammunition was not wasted. He fired 8 rounds in a 2-second burst. 5 hit the target bomber, striking the fuselage behind the cockpit. The bomber's fuselage broke apart. The tail section separated and tumbled. Away. 10 confirmed. 6 cannon rounds remained. 4 bombers continued flying, but his fuel situation was now critical. The fuel gauges showed less than 20% remaining. He was still over 100 miles from friendly territory. If he continued the engagement much longer, he would run out of fuel before reaching base. Yet, as he watched the bombers continue their steady flight, Bong could not bring himself to break off. He positioned for what he knew must be his final attack. 6 cannon rounds, 1 bomber. Approaching from the rear, he closed to 200 yards. The defensive gunners fired desperately. Something struck his right boom, a metallic clang audible even over the engine noise. At 150 yards, Bong pressed the firing button one last time. The 6 remaining 20mm rounds left the cannon in just over 1 second. All 6 hit. The bomber's fuselage ruptured. The aircraft broke into 3 pieces, all tumbling separately toward the jungle. 11 confirmed. Bong's ammunition was completely exhausted. His fuel gauges showed 18%, critically low with 90 miles still to fly. The 3 surviving bombers continued their flight, and Bong had to let them go. He turned south, the mathematics not encouraging. At 80 miles from base, his fuel showed 8%. At 40 miles, 3%. The red warning light illuminated, indicating critically low fuel. At 20 miles from base, his left engine coughed. Fuel starvation. He radioed ahead. Lightning 03, inbound, critically low fuel, request immediate landing clearance. At 5 miles out, the left engine quit completely. Bong feathered it. At 1 mile, the right engine began running rough. At half a mile, the right engine quit entirely, both engines silent. The P-38 was now a glider. The runway threshold passed beneath him. Bong flared. The main wheels touched with a jolt. He was down. The P-38 rolled to a stop, both engines silent, fuel gauges reading 0. Bong climbed out on shaking legs, leaning against the wing as maintenance personnel examined the lightning. "Sir, you have exactly 0 fuel remaining. How the hell did you make it back?" Bong managed a tired smile. "Carefully." The intelligence debriefing lasted over 2 hours. When Bong described the final attack on the bombers with his last 6 cannon rounds, the senior intelligence officer looked up. "Lieutenant, you continued the engagement after your wingman broke off, with minimal ammunition, critically low fuel, over enemy territory?" Bong nodded. "They were still a threat, sir." "That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've heard in this war. Possibly both. But the results speak for themselves. 11 confirmed victories in a single mission. That's a new record for the Pacific Theater. Verification took 3 weeks. In early October 1943, 5th Air Force Headquarters officially credited Bong with 11 confirmed aerial victories for the September 12th mission. The total brought his overall score to 27, exceeding Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record and making Bong America's top ace. The split S maneuver that gave this story its title occurred during the initial engagement over Wewak. A split S involves rolling the aircraft inverted and pulling through into a diving turn. Executing it at low altitude is extraordinarily dangerous. Flight manuals explicitly warned against split S maneuvers below 10,000 feet. Bong, during combat when engaged by multiple Zeros, executed a split S at approximately 8,000 feet below the minimum recommended altitude. The maneuver succeeded because of Bong's intimate knowledge of his aircraft's capabilities and his precise control inputs. He bottomed out at less than 2,000 feet, far too close to the jungle canopy, but alive and having evaded the attacking Zeros. Several pilots who witnessed the maneuver thought Bong had been shot down. When he emerged and climbed back into the fight, it seemed impossible. Bong received the Distinguished Service Cross for the September 12th mission. He was promoted to captain. His photograph appeared in newspapers across the United States. But for Bong, the mission was simply part of his job. In an interview, he downplayed his achievement. "I just did what I was trained to do. Any pilot in my position would have done the same." The correspondent asked about the split S maneuver. "Weren't you worried about crashing?" Bong shrugged. "I knew how much altitude I needed. I knew what the aircraft could do. It was close, but I was confident I could pull it off. And the alternative wasn't acceptable." "So, you broke the rules because the rules didn't fit the situation?" Bong considered this. "I didn't break the rules to be reckless. I broke them because following them would have gotten me killed. There's a difference. You train so that when the moment comes, you can recognize which rules still apply and which ones don't." That statement captured the essence of Bong's approach to combat flying. He was not a reckless pilot seeking glory. He was a calculating tactician who understood that rules and doctrine were tools, not constraints. When the situation demanded deviation from doctrine, he deviated. The key was knowing the difference. Bong continued flying combat missions through 1944, steadily increasing his score. By April 1944, he had 40 confirmed victories, making him the highest-scoring American ace of all time. General George Kenney made the decision to ground Bong and send him back to the United States. Bong returned in May 1944 and spent months on the war bond tour circuit. He hated every minute of it. In September 1944, Bong married Marjorie Vatndal. In October, he returned to the Pacific for a second combat tour. His 40th victory came on December 17, 1944. General Douglas MacArthur personally presented him with the Medal of Honor. Shortly after, Bong was permanently grounded. He returned to the United States in January 1945. The Army Air Forces assigned him to test pilot duties at Lockheed's facility in Burbank, California, evaluating the P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter. On August 6, 1945, the same day the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, Bong was conducting a test flight in a P-80. During takeoff, at approximately 500 feet, the engine flamed out. Bong attempted to restart while positioning for an emergency landing. His aircraft was over a populated area. Landing straight ahead would likely crash into buildings. He tried to turn back to the runway. The P-80, without power and at low altitude, did not have the energy to complete the turn. The aircraft stalled and entered a spin. Bong attempted to bail out, but there was insufficient time for his parachute to deploy. The P-80 crashed in a field. Richard Ira Bong died on impact. He was 24 years old. The news of Bong's death shared the front pages with reports of Japan's surrender. He had survived hundreds of combat missions, faced death repeatedly, and prevailed through skill and courage. And then, with the war essentially over, he died in a peacetime accident. Bong was buried with full military honors at Poplar Cemetery in Wisconsin. General Kenney delivered the eulogy. "Dick Bong was the finest fighter pilot I ever knew. He was brave without being reckless. He was skilled without being arrogant. He was deadly in combat, but gentle in life. We have lost one of the best men this nation ever produced." The legacy of Richard Bong extends far beyond his 40 confirmed victories. He demonstrated that superior skill and tactics could overcome numerical and technical disadvantages. His willingness to break doctrine when the situation demanded it, exemplified by the split S maneuver at low altitude, showed that rules were tools to be applied intelligently rather than constraints to be followed blindly. His systematic approach to aerial combat became the template for fighter pilot training that continues to this day. Modern fighter pilots study Bong's tactics and decision-making processes as examples of effective aerial combat. The P-38 Lightning he flew became legendary, always associated with Bong's achievements. Several aircraft and installations have been named in Bong's honor. The Richard I. Bong Veterans Historical Center in Superior, Wisconsin, preserves his legacy. A restored P-38 Lightning bearing Bong's markings flies occasionally at air shows, keeping his memory alive for new generations. The September 12, 1943 mission over Wewak stands as Bong's single greatest achievement. 11 confirmed victories in one mission, achieved through superior gunnery, aggressive tactics, intelligent risk-taking, and sheer determination. The called split-S maneuver at low altitude, breaking every flight manual rule, epitomized his approach to combat. Know your aircraft, know your capabilities. Know when the rules apply and when they don't. That philosophy proved itself repeatedly throughout his combat career. It was not recklessness. It was calculated aggression, the willingness to accept risk when the tactical situation justified it, combined with the skill to execute high-risk maneuvers successfully. The other pilots who flew with Bong universally praised his abilities while noting that he was not a show-off or glory hound. He didn't fly to build his score. He flew to accomplish the mission. The score was a consequence of doing the job well, not the objective in itself. This attitude distinguished the truly great combat pilots from merely good ones. Good pilots could follow doctrine and achieve respectable results. Great pilots understood when to deviate from doctrine and possessed the skill to make those deviations work. Bong was great. The technical analysis of his September 12 mission reveals patterns that characterize excellent aerial combat performance. He achieved situational awareness, constantly knowing where enemy aircraft were positioned, what his fuel and ammunition states were, what his aircraft's energy state was. He employed vertical maneuvering extensively, using climbs and dives to control engagements. He managed his energy carefully, never allowing himself to become slow and vulnerable. He chose his targets carefully, prioritizing threats and engaging opponents when geometry favored him. He demonstrated exceptional gunnery, destroying aircraft with short bursts. These principles, demonstrated so effectively on that September morning over Wewak, became doctrine for American fighter pilots. They remain relevant today, even in an era of beyond visual range missiles and advanced avionics. The fundamentals of air combat, situational awareness, energy management, precise weapons employment, tactical decision-making, remain constant regardless of technology. Richard Bong's story is one of exceptional skill meeting extreme challenge. A farm boy from Wisconsin who became the deadliest American fighter pilot in history through natural talent, rigorous training, intelligent application of tactics, and courage under fire. His willingness to break the rules when circumstances demanded, exemplified by that low-altitude split-S over Wewak, showed that doctrine serves the warrior, not the other way around. On September 12, 1943, facing impossible odds, Richard Bong executed maneuvers that should have killed him, engaged enemies that outnumbered him, continued fighting when prudence suggested withdrawal, and destroyed 11 enemy aircraft in 17 minutes of combat. It was one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of aerial warfare. The split-S at low altitude that gave this mission its legend was not recklessness. It was the calculated decision of a master tactician who understood his aircraft, knew his capabilities, and recognized that sometimes the most dangerous choice is the only correct one. That judgment, that willingness to break rules in service of the mission, defined Richard Bong's approach to combat and made him America's ace of aces. His legacy endures not in the numbers, though 40 victories speaks for itself, but in the example he set. Excellence comes from mastering fundamentals. Success comes from intelligent risk-taking. Survival comes from knowing when to follow doctrine and when to throw it away. These lessons, learned in the skies over New Guinea and paid for with the lives of 11 Japanese pilots on a single September morning, remain as relevant today as they were 80 years ago. Richard Ira Bong died at 24, his potential unfulfilled, his life cut short by a mechanical failure in peacetime that he had avoided hundreds of times in combat. But what he accomplished in his brief time changed aerial warfare forever. The farm boy who learned to fix tractors became the pilot who mastered the P-38 Lightning. The student who absorbed doctrine became the warrior who knew when to ignore it. The young man from Wisconsin became the legend whose name remains synonymous with aerial combat excellence. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.